Okay, so now let's talk about our growth and our external financing. So we looked at with the previous percent of sales approach, we saw in order to fund that growth, we were $200 short in cash. So we got to look at see how we can grow. Okay, if what we're going to talk about next with these growth rates, a slow growth level, look at figure 4.1 in your book. Okay, you can see that um, the more horizontal line is our projected retained earnings. The more 45-degree angle line there is what we want to increase our sales or our required growth. Okay. And when you look at that, you can see the little triangle there that's kind of green. That is at low growth levels. So at low growth levels, our internal financing, meaning our retained earnings, will be enough to pay for that growth. And we wouldn't need to go out and get um, external money. Now, obviously, normally we want to grow as much as we can. Okay, so we want to have higher rates of growth and increase that growth rate. Well, when you're looking at that figure, that is the more slate colored, I guess, triangle there. And now our growth rate exceeds the funding that we have with our retained earnings. Okay. And so to be able to fund our growth, we're going to have to look at our capital structure, and we got to go and get uh, money from the outside. So we're going to have to go into those capital markets to either to get debt or equity to help us continue with our growth rate. Okay. So we're looking at the relationship between growth and external financing needed, or EFN, for our long range planning. Okay. Uh, the first thing we're going to look at is internal growth rate, or IGR. This is how much we can grow using only our retained earnings as a source of financing, meaning we're not going to get new debt. Okay. And so if we look at that, the formula, we have return on assets. And if you remember from our chapter 3, that equation. Now the B here, B is what we call our plowback. Okay. And what that is that's the percent of net income that is retained earnings. Okay. Now remember that is our, that is basically our retention ratio. Okay. So we're looking at retention ratio. Understand it is the percent of that. Okay. And we take that and divide that by 1 minus our ROA times B. Okay. This is wrong. The retained earnings, the ROA, B is not the dividend payout ratio. It's the retained earnings ratio. Okay, so pay attention to that. Okay, so here's our formula. If we look at our numbers, we can see going back to, and notice folks, this is not on the pro forma. This is on our actual numbers. So we're using our actual numbers, not our pro forma numbers. We have our net income, we have our assets there, and then we have our ROA. Our dividend policy was a 50-50 policy. Okay, so you can see that when we do this using just our internal growth, our retained earnings, we can grow our company 6.74%. Okay, now not a bad growth rate. The thing is, here we would not be getting any debt. Okay, so our debt to equity ratio, think about this. If we're not adding debt, we're growing our company, but we're growing it with just the money from retained earnings. We are not getting any more debt. What's going to happen to that debt to equity ratio? A eventually that debt to equity ratio, the debt is going to keep dwindling down because we're going to pay that off. Eventually, we're going to have our company being financed completely by equity. So as we do that, our equity multiplier is going to start decreasing and get to 1. Okay. Now, we can look at our sustainable growth rate, and this is the maximum we could grow using both our internal funds and using debt. We're maintaining a constant debt to equity ratio. All right. So if you think about it, we're paying off debt. We're paying off the old debt on the back side, or on the front side, and on the back side, we're adding debt. And as we add it, though, we're bringing in retained earnings. As our company grows, that retained earning number is going to grow, that debt number is going to grow. But the key here is this right here. We maintain a constant debt to equity ratio. If we're doing that, then our equity multiplier won't change and it'll stay the same. You can see the formula is pretty much the same, except we're using ROE, return on equity, instead of return on assets. Okay. So we'll plug that in and we can see, we get those numbers again, and we can see our growth rate now is 17%. So if we're owners of the company, we're looking at, how much we can grow. Do we want to grow 7 or grow 17%? Obviously, we want to try to grow more, but we want to do it responsibly. So that's the key. And again, that goes back to our planning, making sure that our plans are feasible and consistent with our values, and just making sure we're true to who we are as we grow our company. Okay. So thinking about the return on assets, the return on equity, let's talk about some of these determinants of growth. Okay. Obviously, the first one being profit margin, our operating efficiency. Okay. The next one is our total asset turnover, how well our assets, how efficient we are with using our assets. The last one is our financial leverage, our choice of debt and equity that we're putting together, our equity multiplier. By the way, if you recall, those 3 things go into your return on equity from Chapter 3, the DuPont identity. So again, that comes back into play. Okay. And obviously, the last thing is our dividend policy. How much are we going to pay to our shareholders versus how much we're going to keep in retained earnings to fund our own growth. Okay. All right. So that's it for Chapter 4 with our growth. We have, our thought processes, our planning horizon. We have percent of sales approach, our internal growth rate, and our sustainable growth rate.